Hey, and welcome to the Growing Leaders Podcast.
Hey, Christine.
This podcast exists because the topic of growing next generation leaders is really important.
It's a hot one.
It is.
Yeah.
Jamie, why are we here today?
All right. So today we're talking about what may be my favorite topic of all time. Missional creativity. It's not what you think. So, when you say missional creativity, you'd think it's about being creative in evangelizing and stuff. And that's a topic we talk about a lot here. And that's true too. That's really, really great. But actually, it's a little more macro, I think. Mm-hmm. It's a bigger conversation of like, in some ways, it's kind of like, where's Waldo? But it's more like, where's God? It's like, what are all the things that God is doing right now? And then even thinking about it in the context of the way of what God's doing across history. And so it's very fun. And I'll say one thought and then kick it back to you to hear your thoughts, is like, we're going to talk to Tyler Prieb today. He's a missiologist. He's a pastor and entrepreneur. He's based in New York City, and he's a leader with a thing called Missional Labs, which is great. And we'll get to hear him talk more about it today. But as I was thinking about this and kind of reading through some of Tyler's stuff and talking to you before this, I was thinking that in every single moment, Jesus is coming into a place and a time. Like right now, we're here in Gwinnett County, Georgia, but then we're connected with leaders around the world, and we're watching him do that. And he does it in a way that is really effective, and it kind of connects all of us in a way where we go together into what happens. And that forms, we won't want to say this, but it forms institutions, which is just the way you do things. We had a friend, Dr. Dow Robinson, and I was standing in the line to get food after a wedding, and he was like, I love what you did with the wedding. And I was like, because I had performed the wedding, and I said, oh, well, thanks. He said, boy, you have a chance to just completely redefine those kind of sacraments, how weddings are and how funerals are. I was so aghast. I was like, what are you talking about? A wedding's a wedding, a funeral's a funeral. And he was just saying, there was creativity to what you did today, and there can be creativity around those things. And then I think later in the conversation, I was like, yeah, but we're all aiming towards Acts 2:42, which of course for us, we are. And he said, well, that's how God did it for those guys. I mean, this is Dr. Dow Robinson, translated the Bible into Aztec, Wycliffe Bible translator, historic leader. But what he was saying is, you're seeing a snapshot in Acts of how the Holy Spirit, and in that Jesus comes into this group of leaders that Jesus had already gotten a hold of, and what happens in that time in history. And his point was just, that's happening again and again in your lives. So that's the creativity. It's always Jesus and stuff like that. But sometimes we get caught up in the institutions. We get caught up in the scaffolding, and we pay all of our attention to the scaffolding, like what church looks like, what the liturgy is, how many worship songs, are you leading the women's group? But we miss the big picture, and it's not so much fun. And I don't think it's that effective either. So what does that make you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what happens. I think as you're talking, I was like, I wanted to look up the exact definition of an institution, but it's an institution, established law, practice, or custom, a society or organization founded on religious, educational, social, or similar purposes. Yeah. It's which when we do that, it's what makes us feel safe. Yeah. Which the Holy Spirit isn't safe. Like when we are at our best and we are engaging mission when we don't feel super comfortable, because what's comfortable to us is to minimize and to bring order. But that is what creates the institution. And so where the Holy Spirit is and where the Lord leads is these creative places. We snuff out the creativity once we institutionalize it. Once we create a program, or once we establish the boundaries, that's what happens. We put boundaries to like the framework. We say this is then where God can move, or this is how mission or how ministry will work. And I think we get trapped, and it's actually kind of dangerous, because then we're putting God in a box, which is the one thing none of us actually want to do, or I would hope none of us want to do. And then we wonder why then, like, we feel like the programs or the initiatives are a little suffocated and lack the spirit or creativity.
Yeah, I think as leaders, as we bring Tyler on in the next few minutes, as leaders, we have a really important fear of the Lord discipline we need, which is that we're hooked on, connected to, and looking to Jesus. And then, of course, we need the order and we need the polity and we need the safe places for people to come together. That's great. Those scaffoldings will need to be put up, torn down, even some kept out there for a while. But it's Jesus. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. That's our job. And if we do that, then we'll use the scaffolding for good purposes, great purposes. And honestly, at the end of our lives, we'll hear good, well done, good and faithful servant. But if we forget Jesus, that's where you get dead churches. That's where you lose the next generation. Because first of all, a next generation is not called by God to the scaffolding from a previous generation. They're called to Jesus. And so when we get mad and we feel like we're losing them because they're not as excited by our old scaffolding, we probably need to get rid of our old scaffolding like 5 years ago ourselves. So in a way, there should be a hopeful conversation because there are keys to this regardless of which generation you're part of what's next. All right, we're back with Tyler Prieb. Tyler, we already said some stuff about you in the intro, but you're in New York City, is that right?
Yeah, I'm in New York City. I live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with my wife and our little 5-month-old daughter.
Okay, so the number one question for me is, are you a basketball fan?
I'm not really a basketball fan. I grew up in the Midwest, so college basketball was my speed.
Well, there's some good stuff there. All right. We're very excited to have you on today. There's a lot of great ways to touch some of the content that you're producing these days. Tyler, you're with Missional Labs, and we'll give you a chance in a second to talk about that as what you've put down here in an innovation consultancy and a startup studio for the church. We've gotten to touch it a little bit. It's very exciting. So excited to hear you talk about that. But you also spent some time and are in and around the church of the city of New York. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was a part of our church planting team and was on our staff for about 5 or 6 years here in Midtown Manhattan.
Well, that's fun and really, really exciting. So, we're talking today, the basic content that we put out there is the title is Missional Creativity. It's not what you think. And our point is we're not really talking about missionary efforts or even ministry efforts on the micro in this conversation. We're much more talking about the macro of the creativity of what God's doing in the world and across history. And so you're a really good voice to have here. But I would love to start out a little bit, and you can even get into, if you'd like to, into Missional Labs a bit. But first of all, you just starting by telling us a little bit about you and your journey and how it's formed your unique vantage point for your perceptions of what God's up to these days.
Yeah, sure. I would love to. I mean, the quick background is that, I grew up in a ministry, a pretty traditional, typical ministry family. My dad was a pastor. There were other pastors and elders in my extended family and a number of missionaries, actually. And I was really, really inspired by some of the kind of the great uncles and second cousins and stuff that were out on the mission field in Congo and Pakistan and India. And I just got this imagination for having a big world and getting this invitation to be a part of what God is doing. As I was a kid in small town Kansas, I had all this imagination for what God might be doing around the world. And so really set out with that sense of a call to ministry, a call to mission, a desire to go to the frontier, whatever the front line looks like of advancing the gospel and advancing the kingdom. And most of my vocational journey has just been figuring out how to do that in the 21st century and in the modern world. We don't really live in the same world today as my great uncle when he got on a boat and went to the Congo in 1950. We don't live in that world anymore. So I've been trying to translate, what does it really look like to be on mission? What does it look like to be on the front lines of God's redemptive purposes, the expansion of his kingdom, the expansion of his church in our time and place, with all of the changes in, culture and the changes in how the world is organized, changes in technology, changes in access, all these sorts of things. And my entire career has basically been a meditation on that question, whether working in nonprofit contexts, church contexts, entrepreneurial contexts. But I basically came to terms with the fact that I didn't have language for this for a long time, but that I'm essentially a missiologist, somebody that is reflecting about the mission of God and how it moves forward in the world across different contexts, different people groups, and in different cultural spaces around the world. So that's kind of the core category. And also, I guess I would say um, a bit of an entrepreneur in the sense that I always wanted to be more on the front lines of whatever is happening in the early stages of what's coming next. And so, and I guess the only other thing I would nuance with that and is you sort of said this, I think missiology has a number of different levels to it. And, I studied economics when I was younger, and economics, for example, as a parallel, has macro and micro, right? Um, Macro is the study of how all of the economic activity of a country rolls up into institutions and policies and GDP and aggregate composite scores and all this stuff. And micro is like, how is an individual consumer going to make a purchasing decision, and what's the price elasticity and all that sort of thing. And I think with mission we have kind of the same thing. Micro is, how do you equip the average person to follow Jesus and to follow them well, and to live out their story in harmony with the story of God, and to live creatively and live on purpose in public and whatever their life looks like, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or you're in business, you're in finance, whatever. Macro missiology is more of the large scale reflection about what God is doing in the world in our time and history, and that has to do with networks and movements and church planting and unreached people groups and technology and scale, like all these other types of conversations. So I think both of those are very important. I think they're different conversations.
Yeah. So today we're not talking about widgets, not so much.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's right. Okay. So first of all, that's all great. I think it would be great right now, just even so Christine gets to know you too, is to understand a little bit about what you guys are doing around missional labs, which is extremely exciting. And it's part of it's exactly basically a vehicle for doing some of the things that you just talked about. So yeah. So, take us through just a little bit of what Missional Labs is doing.
Sure. So the core idea behind Missional Labs would be this idea of missional innovation, right? What is it going to look like to reach the next generation, to reach the future, to reach the next 100 years of society with the gospel? And what are the new wineskins, the new structures that are going to be I guess, relevant for that task? Now, look, some people like innovation language in the church. Some people don't. Some people are threatened by it. What are you talking about? Is this theological innovation, or is this just like technological, structural? Like, what are we talking about here? But I think in general, most people understand, if you're in any church, conference or conversation or whatever, it always starts with the same problem, at least in the West. And the problem is that everything is headed down into the right. It's this narrative of decline. It's this narrative of people are leaving the church. People are deconstructing. People are walking away from the faith. And, there's some alarmism about that, and probably rightly so in some ways. COVID obviously was very apocalyptic for the Western church in some ways. But in that, you begin to see hints of renewal. And renewal would be kind of the spiritual side of innovation, or I think maybe let me get the phrasing right. Revival, spiritual awakening. These would be the personal spiritual sides of renewal. Innovation and entrepreneurship, I think, would be the structural sides of renewal, right? You're going to see people, as decline is happening further and further, God begins to move in new ways, right? Because the existing paradigms have become swept away, a new generation comes in, all these sorts of things happen, and new things begin to emerge. So all that to say is that I think innovation is the task of coming alongside, supporting and accelerating the new things that God is doing to advance the church and to reach people with the gospel in new, contextual, credible, plausible, beautiful ways, where the gospel can make sense to them, where the person of Jesus can resonate with them, right? And so Missional Labs is basically an organization that helps advance that work. It helps advance those projects. And so we're trying to ask questions like, how do you reach people with the gospel in a digital age? How do you reach people with the gospel in a secular age? What does discipleship look like as the way that we do church changes? what does discipleship look like when maybe there isn't a vibrant church in a given city or locality or community? What does church planting look like in the future? How do we begin to think about engaging the culture with the story of the gospel as it becomes more secular and less Christianized? Right? Those are sort of the innovation reflection questions. And then out of that, how do you design and launch new initiatives and new ventures that can aim at creating new breakthrough solutions to some of those problems, if that makes sense. And there's a lot more to it, but that's the big idea.
Yeah. At the core, though, I think what I heard you say is that you're looking for these creative endeavors that can kind of answer the question of how can you have missionary encounters, in today, in each of these contexts. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, so look, if you reverse engineer it a little bit and you look around the world and you say, what are the effective ministries and movements and missions organizations and the people stewarding the gospel and the people that have, I was just at the Billy Graham Museum in Charlotte a few months ago. It's like, that was a whole thing that happened in a given moment. But if you take those all the way back before they were impacting nations, before they were filling stadiums, before they were, student movements like InterVarsity or Navigators or before they were billion-dollar charities like World Vision and Compassion, or before they were, huge seminaries or theological institute, like all these kind of large-scale organizations, you can trace them all the way back to when they were startups. And you don't think about them as startups, but a lot of the major ministries and missions organizations that exist in the world today that are mature, most of them started in the same 10-year period after World War II.
Sure.
Right. So then you ask, well, what was going on then? Well, obviously there was like cultural change. There was a new generation of leaders. There was kind of a spirit of optimism and a spirit of possibility. There was an urgency to the evangelistic task. There was all these things that happened that basically led to people saying, we got to do something. We need to start something. We need to like mobilize something. And out of that came leaders that led to organizations that led to global movements and communities that have been a big part of the story of the advancement of the gospel around the world in the past 100 years. So if you look at that story, then you begin to have a lens to say, well, who is in the first 5 years of that process now? Who's going to build the organizations of the next 50 years of the church today? Because if you build from the ground up, you get to contextualize in new ways. You get to build digital first. You get to build global first. You get to build with you get to do all these things that Campus Crusade and Navigators and Young Life and YWAM, like all these organizations can't do anymore because they're at a different stage in their organizational life cycle.
Yeah, that gets exciting.
Yeah.
One thought that would be kind of fun to have you do is thank you for all that. And that really helps put into perspective Missional Labs. And it's exciting for people to get to follow and see how you guys progress in all of this. But one thought is kind of looking at the actual landscape. I've seen you kind of run through from a sociological and historical point of view this moment, but the decline of some institutional realities, while these kind of seemingly heretical realities are kind of rising. Would you feel comfortable kind of running through that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the first thing I would say is that the current landscape of the church and the current landscape of mission looks very different in different parts of the world. So this is primarily a Western conversation in some ways. If you're in India or if you're in Sub-Saharan Africa, if you're in Brazil, like it's a very different moment. And so I don't want to superimpose like a Western American kind of thing onto the world. I think that we're in a particular moment that comes out of our Western cultural story, cultural history. But I am definitely not the first or the best or anywhere close to the brightest person talking about secularism and talking about the cultural kind of changes in American and Western society, right? That is a well-documented story in some ways. The question is, if you're a Christian and if you have a vested interest in the work of the church, the advancement of the gospel, the discipleship of people, a winsome engagement with culture, the question is, what do you do about it? Mm-hmm. What do you do about it? And we've seen all these people feeling for these kind of large scale answers, like, take back the culture for Jesus, right? That's like that's a big answer that a lot of people have put their bet on. One is just like run for the hills and kind of put your head down and say, don't come after us, kind of a thing. You know, the Benedict option maybe
Yes.
is like the most winsome version of that idea. Um, there's a strong Pentecostal undercurrent that would say, hey, cultural engagement might or might not be our thing, but we are going to pray and we are going to seek God and we're going to go after the Holy Spirit and say, hey, look, strategy isn't gonna do anything for us. We need the work of the Holy Spirit. So you can have various levels of optimism, pessimism, publicly engaged, publicly withdrawn, and I think the church collectively in the West is feeling that out, right? I think it's feeling that out. I think that from a historical perspective, which was your question, I think that basically you can see through history that whenever there are massive movements of mission, whether it's mobilization, in various forms, whether it's like a John Wesley, George Whitefield circuit riders kind of a thing, whether you've got like the Victorian era explosion of like missionary societies and global mobilization efforts, all the way back to even you go back into Europe and it's the monastics and the scholastics and the Dark Ages, or the Jesuits and the Dominican, like all these sort of renewal orders and structures that emerge. They always emerge out of a form of spiritual awakening and renewal, and a lack of capacity and agility of the institutional church. So I think you start to look for those things and say, okay, what is that going to look like for us? And I mean, there's so many examples. You could go back to the Moravians, right? This is
Sure.
a very prototypical example.
Yeah.
Massive prayer movement in the middle of like kind of the disruptions of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. You got a lot of refugee type people coming together, and then boom, spiritual awakening. And then they were really the first missions movement going all over the planet, from Zinzendorf's little hut in Moravia. So I think you begin to see this cycle. It's a cycle of, stabilization, decline, and then that's when the Holy Spirit begins to do his work, I think. And so I think that we're kind of somewhere in that phase now and into the next, decade or so.
Yeah, and so that creates these pioneer networks, and groups like the Moravians, they make a huge difference in a John Wesley. And all of a sudden you start to see an emerging new system. And then you focus on, and we really focus on in our work, communities of practice that form.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just being surrounded by other people that are equally finding the kind of bubbling up of God's grace and power in these ways, and saying, hey, we're not crazy, or wow, it's happening for you guys too.
Yeah. So, there was a missiologist named Ralph Winter, who you've probably heard of. He was behind the Fuller School of World Mission and the U.S. Center for World Mission and the Perspectives course and all this stuff. And he talked about, he's the guy that coined the phrase unreached people groups in the 70s. And he talked a lot about how God's redemptive purposes typically have two structures through history. Not everybody agrees with him on this. There's different debates, but he basically says there's the local congregational structure, and then there's the scalable missional structure. And I think sometimes we lose that because we get caught in these debates about church versus parachurch and what is a nonprofit and what is we get caught in all this. But it's this idea that that there are a lot of different forms that God has used throughout history to organize and to advance the gospel. And so with that, I think that's one helpful lens. Another helpful lens is Alan Hirsch, who I think is a very fantastic missiologist, has really brought back the APEST, the fivefold giftings from that Paul talked about in the New Testament, about the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teacher. And that's a super helpful lens, because a lot of time what happens in the Western church, this is his insight, is that churches tend to consolidate around the shepherd and the teacher gift, right? And that means that the apostolic, evangelistic, and prophetic gift typically don't have a structural home. This is why if someone is a prophet or an evangelist, they end up having their own secondary organization a lot of times. And so then the question is, where's the apostolic instinct? And the apostolic instinct doesn't map perfectly onto entrepreneurship, but it does map onto it somewhat. It's that entrepreneurial instinct to push against the edge, to see things that aren't there yet, and to go push into it. And so then, to your point, what does it look like to build an emerging community of practice around the apostolic instinct? And I think that's a very fascinating question. Typically, that looks like, I don't know, maybe a church planting network, right? Or maybe like a mission society, right? Or something like that. But I think that we've lost a bit of the categories for that. And so one of the things that I've been looking for is like, where are you going to begin to find these pockets of emerging communities of mission and innovation, emerging communities of the apostolic instinct?
Yeah, I want to throw it to you, Christine, for a final question. One thing we've done as I listen to you and hear your work, that we've really focused on that you had the modalities and sodalities in the early church. You had these traveling apostolic bands that then St. Patrick utilized as well, alongside abbey churches or alongside back then the local house churches. We really launched these teams again, where you have these teams that can get out where churches can't get, and actually have had a lot of time. We have a whole session in the conference on houses and teams of how the two can work together.
Yeah.
And we just had Jerry White, who was one of the key leader with Navigators for so many years and wrote a book on parachurch and the church back in the 70s. And he was kind of talking about the same stuff. So I really do think it's very fascinating, that part, what you're talking about. But we've got to honor his time. What's the big last question?
Oh, I have two.
Uh-oh.
But I'll make them quick.
Okay.
Yeah, one, I think this is a very much deja vu moment from a few weeks ago when we were with Jerry White, which is very exciting because it means, like, I think the conversation is a very important conversation. But you've mentioned a lot in everything you've said of just like the hints of renewal. And I think for some of our listeners, it would be helpful to probably hear what some of those are, just because, like, if you're a church or if you're in the marketplace and you acknowledge that the existing structures, like, they're just not working. We're at the end of something, but we're not quite at the beginning of the next thing. I think it would be helpful for people to hear, like, what are some of those new things that we see him doing, or what are some of those innovations that we see coming, or, like, we've mentioned technology, we've mentioned all these different things. It is different. You don't get on a boat with your coffin and all of your things to go to another country and then your body gets sent back. You can go back and forth on a plane, and you can, most places in rural Africa have 3G networks at least, so you can text back. And so, like, things are different, but what are some of those innovations or some of those things that you are seeing that are working?
Well, so it's really interesting because I don't like getting overly fixated on technology. A lot of people get really fixated on technology specifically. Technology is simply a form of leverage. It's a tool. It's an amplification tool. It's an amplification device, the same way that an airplane is or the Roman road was. It lets you do more and go farther and go faster with less effort. Okay, so that's fine. What all that means is that people that are doing compelling things will gain a bigger hearing faster than they did in the past. And obviously there's downsides to that. We're living in this kind of celebrity kind of the moment, like there's a lot wrong with that, but there's also a lot of opportunity in that. And so if you're somebody that is able to live radically, prophetically, authentically, and counterculturally wherever you are, that has a massive amount of potency and potential to change the narrative and to create a different story about what the gospel is and what it looks like to be a Christian in our cultural moment. And so all that to say is, like, the power of a single prophetic life living a compelling story is so big right now. It's so big right now. And ultimately, I think we're called to be countercultural. And what that means is we're called to identify the dominant idols of a cultural sphere and then to live radically compelling prophetic lives in the opposite direction. Right. So if everyone's, if the whole world is swimming in iPhones, how do Christians have a compelling story about, like, the power of community and the power of presence and the power of rest and the power of Sabbath, and vice versa? If everybody's living scared, how do Christians live lives that are courageous and compelling and creative and bold? I think that that's kind of it's John Tyson talks about this idea of living at the redemptive edge, right? How do we live at the redemptive edge of culture, at the redemptive edge of society? And so to me, that's where renewal happens, right? It's where the collisions are between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the world. And people that can live on that edge, I think are going to be radically impactful over the next season.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. All right, so my last question.
Last question.
I know this last one, so hopefully it's a good one. In one of your essays that you have on your blog, so if you want to get any of his stuff, you can go to Prieb.co. but you're talking about the renewal, the revival, renewal, and mission. You mentioned these dominant systems, just a little bit. It's the structures. So it's like the structures that are coming down, the structures that are coming up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in that bridge, because I think we currently, anyone who's listening to this, if you're a leader or if you're are existing right now and you're not under 25, you are existing in that bridge.
Mm-hmm.
What does that bridge look like? Like, what are some? It requires agility, because like you're gonna be, if you're gonna do it well, you're at the end of something, and you're gonna be a part of, you're that part of that conduit for the thing that's coming, for the leaders that are coming. So there's making
So
room,
you
there's
might
making
be in a
space.
church that's still functioning within dominant system kind of realities, but you're leaning forward. So,
Like, how
right.
do you do that well? So for
Yeah.
pastors, it's ending well. For someone who's in the middle of kind of
Yeah.
starting something, it's being really agile for like the things that are changing. But what would you say to that listener, or to that reality?
Yeah, I love that question. And maybe just to contextualize it, like the bridge is basically how do you build connectivity between old systems and new systems?
Yeah.
Um, and it's not evident that there will necessarily be a bridge, right? I mean, in the business world, you think about competition, hostile takeovers, mergers, acquisition. There's all these ways of dominant players trying to maintain dominance and keep off, emerging disruptors. And I'm not just trying to apply innovation theory to the church purely or anything like that. But if you are a mature organization, if you're a mature seasoned leader, if you are an organization that has some resources, some encoded wisdom, some a web of relationships, distribution, all these kinds of things, you have a responsibility to begin to answer that question. What does the future look like, and how do we invest in it effectively? Now, the challenge is that most people probably don't realize that they're part of a dominant system, because you're still trying to survive and you're trying to raise your own money and you're trying to keep things from, but ultimately it's like, how do you hand off the wisdom and the invested kind of the encoded assets of your ecosystem, your organization, your social institution, um, to you know, emerging leaders, emerging structures, emerging opportunities that are going after your same mission,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a multi-generational thinking. And you can do that both internally and externally, right? There's internal innovation and there's external innovation. Internal innovation looks like raising up leaders. It looks like investing in developing leaders. It looks like investing in disruptive ideas. It looks like piloting new projects and programs and opportunities. That's all internal. External means scanning the horizon for what's out there and figuring out how to build bridges to it and connecting to it. And that might be investing time, investing manpower, investing money, investing social kind of relational capital, all that sort of stuff. But I think in the end, um, I think that the kingdom flourishes when we build those bridges effectively. And I think there's a net loss when we kind of clench our fists, so to speak.
That's great.
Yeah.
This is great. We've had a fun time with you today.
Yeah, I hope it was helpful. I mean, I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about.
There's
This
so
is
much we
really,
could talk
really
about.
cool.
No, that gets us coming back at you, asking
You
you
just
to come
opened the
on
door.
again.
Yeah,
So come back.
we can do a part 2. But hey, this is a fun conversation. This is stuff that I love. So thank you for the chance to dialogue with you guys today.
Yeah, thank you too. All right, Christine, that was a pretty amazing conversation. I can never tell whether things are amazing conversations for everybody or just for me.
Or if we just get excited.
But for me, that was a very amazing conversation, and a really cool parallel to our conversation a few weeks ago with Jerry White with Navigators. Just two different generations touching things. But Tyler did such an amazing job of kind of pulling out to 30,000 feet or maybe 60,000 feet and describing a lot of things that I think have been themes and threads running across this podcast from the beginning. But you were sitting over there and you only got to ask those two questions at the end. What were you thinking?
I thought it was great. I think if you are a listener and you have been with us from the beginning since last summer when we launched the podcast, then you know these are a lot of the same. He's saying a lot of the same things that we've been asking questions for, a lot of the conversations we've been having. So on one hand, I was very encouraged because we're having the right conversation. We're not just sitting here in our friend's studio just having fun, but we're asking the right questions. And I think, and I said this to you off camera a second ago, but I think part of what's happening and how he does such a good job at synthesizing some of the things that are resonating in our hearts, and I hope are resonating with your hearts as a listener, is he's asking these questions not just from a 30,000 mile or feet perspective, but it's from the perspective of just what's God doing today. And it's out of that, he said, as a kid, he had this sense of imagination, and he's been asking this question, what does it look like today? So what is the invitation, or what is the work of God look like today? And that's the question he's been asking since he was a child. It's not a reactionary question, which usually when we're looking for the answer of like, oh, what's God doing today? It's a reaction to something that's happened, which I think is really interesting to note. Because if you're looking for the answer because something has happened, like there's a situation in your church or in your marriage or with your youth group or with a young person, you're looking for a very micro answer. So it's a very micro question where it's like, God, what are you doing today? And you're like wanting this all-consuming direction, but it's very, very hyper-specific situation. So you can't really apply that big truth to that situation. So then, like, he helps us he helps us in the day-to-day and in the moment-to-moment. But I think it's really important for us to take a step back and look at where is God leading today for the church and for the next generation.
Yeah. And one of the things that Tyler referenced and we've referenced before is there was a great missionary and missiologist named Leslie Newbigin that if you care about missions, you know the name. And he was an English missionary that went to India. And this is probably is during the 50s, 60s or before that. But basically, he's coming from a country that is Christian to go over and reach these unreached people groups. And he's working at it, right? And all of a sudden, as you hit into the 50s, 60s, if you think about it, all of a sudden English people, you start seeing English people showing up in India to look into Krishna or Hindu. And he's like, wait, we're the ones that are reached, supposed to be here. What's going on? So he ends up back in England. And he recognizes that the West has changed, where once it was Christian England or Christian United States reaching the whole world. The group that was supposed to be the missionaries needs missionaries now. And he starts turning to say, okay, well, I was reaching India. How do we turn and reach, England? And he actually finds that it's really hard. And he says basically that the West now is one of the most difficult mission fields in the world. And so he comes to Princeton at one point and he asks this question of, can you have a missionary encounter with the West? How do you do it? And that question has been the question across the 1980s. He wrote a great book called Foolishness to the Greeks. But the question is a big question that Tim Keller was centered around. It's something that Tyler's work is centered around. It is the question that he's kind of asking that all of this comes out of is, how do you best come and engage people in Gwinnett County, or for those guys in Manhattan, or in Orange County, California, or in Australia, or wherever? And that brings up all of a sudden a really interesting, totally different narrative than what we hear these days. Which what we hear these days is things are tough. It's going so bad. But it's almost like a Road to Emmaus moment where you realize, no, it's not what you think. This isn't the worst day. This is actually the best day. There's so much going on. And so he's charting and talking and identifying groups with a very sunny disposition, while sometimes we hear people that are kind of sad. So,
well, and I think part of what's happening too, and everything that you're saying, is everyone's tired. It's been a white knuckle moment for a lot of people of just like the waiting for it to get better, or if we can just pray more. But part of what we're seeing in the West too is it's like trickle down faith, where it's like it started with your grandparents or your great grandparents, or even sometimes with your parents, but you have a whole generation of people who may have met him or who like have heard of him but don't really know him. And I think that's one of the big cultural shifts that's taken place. And so I think
and you mean by that just having a cultural faith or cultural Christianity won't get you very far right now?
It won't get you anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's what's dying, because like the church isn't dying.
No.
But what is killing churches is cultural Christianity.
Yeah.
Because it's groupthink, it's group realities versus personal realities with Jesus. And so it really needs to, and that's part of why I asked the question, the bridge question, because we are, you see this gap widening of what worked once, and it worked, it really did, but it's not working today. And so then what do we need today is going to start to take form and shape, but you have this gap of what worked and what is working. And so then how do we stand in the gap to create that bridge is a really important conversation for any leader today.
Yeah, and he talked about that. How do we live at the redemptive age, at the redemptive edge? He quoted John Tyson there. How do you live those prophetic lives? And he said, if you do, they're really powerful. Mm-hmm. And some of that goes back to the importance of being able to hear God's voice, and the book that we just brought out, Forgotten Pieces, and living in moment-to-moment intimacy, and living by faith even when it involves suffering, and finding and fulfilling what God's called you to, or your purpose, and then life in the power of the Holy Spirit. So those things really, really help. So it just makes you kind of excited by all this. Yeah,
it's not then a condemning or scary conversation of like, oh, it's the end of the church.
No.
It's actually, it's the beginning of what's coming.
That's right.
And so then how do we prepare our hearts and then the people we lead, and then be ready for what's coming?
Amen, sister. That's great.